Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Masechet Demai, Chapter 1, Halacha 3, Uses of Demai. And we're going to start off with two other stories of saints that are going to be Tanaim that also had interesting experience with regards to being strict on separations. Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa was sitting and dining one Sabbath evening, and the table collapsed before him. In other words, the table fell down on this Shabbat, and you can imagine what would happen in your life if your Shabbat table collapsed. Gemara continues, and the members of the household said to him, "What is the meaning of this?" And he said to them, "This is the reason. I borrowed spice for the meal for my neighbor, but I did not tithe it." And the idea is that he took it from the wife of an Amma Arts, says Rosh Cirilio. And he also says that this is a reference to a spice that by itself is edible. But I want to point out that spices normally are going to be exempt from maestros. So this must have been a type of spice that could have been eaten on its own. And the Gemara continues and it says, "But I did not tithe it." And so Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, who was a Tana, remembered the conditional formula that he uttered before the Shabbat to enable him to separate the tithes on the Shabbat, and he deemed separated the tithes. Normally that on Shabbat you're not allowed to directly separate tithes physically, but they do have a formula where you can separate the tithes mentally, and then you can attribute one thing for another, and then go and separate it out after Shabbat, and then you leave over part of it on the Shabbat, so that it is. But you don't actually make a specific physical separation, and you don't make a physical statement. You don't actually utter a statement. It's going to be a mental thing. So what happened was that the table collapsed because the tithes were not separated, and once they had been separated, the table rose back by themselves. And the Vilna Goan explains that Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa merely reminded himself mentally of this Erev Shabbos condition, and the idea, says the Vilna Goan, is that he had to mention the condition orally on the Shabbos, and make a mental thing about it, so that it could be done in a way. It's very special on how to do these separations and on Shabbat, and that's going to get covered in Demai chapter 7 halacha 1. But basically, Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa is trying to show that he's at a very high level, and he's normally very strict with himself. And so this is going to be a case where he got something that was a spice that, again, normally spices don't need maestros to be separated from it, but it could be where this one could potentially be edible on its own, and he didn't separate the tithes. And so when a tzaddik gets to be at a higher and higher level, then a Kodesh Baruch Hu becomes more strict with him. And that's why it's so important to learn Torah and to learn the details of the Torah law, so that when you make yourself more holy, that you can operate at a higher level. Again, we see that, for what seemed like to be a very small transgression when Moshe Rabbeinu hit the rock, it caused him not to enter the land. And so it looks like not a big deal, but when you climb up this ladder of holiness and you get closer to the divine source, you can only afford to have fewer and fewer and smaller mistakes. So perhaps what happened was Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, like what we saw earlier with Rabbi Zera, should have separated this out and did not. And by the way, this is going to be where he was not strict on himself for separating out Demai. And he obviously assumed that this Amma Aretz lady separated out Truma Gedola. And again, you don't need to separate out tithes for spices normally for maestros or anything like that. However, somebody at this Tana's level, it would be assumed that he should be strict on himself. And so he separated out these tithes, and the table rose back and put itself together. And they have a similar story with another Tana, Rabbi Tarfon. And the story says like this, that he was sitting and dining, and his bread fell away from him. And the members of the household said to him, "What is the meaning of this?" And Rabbi Tarfon said, "I borrowed an axe from an Amaretz, and I prepared tahor food using it without purifying it first." So in other words, Rabbi Tarfon, who by the way was a Goan, he was careful to eat food that had the tahara status of truma, like most Kohanim are doing and supposed to do, especially at this time. And what happened was, by the bread falling, Shemayim was actually indicating, says Rabbi Kanievsky, that the bread was not tahor, it wasn't up to his standard. And so we know in Kalim, in the Mishnahs in Kalim, we know that an axe, being a cutting tool, by the way, also can be a weapon, that depending on how it's going to be attached to the wood, that it can become tameh. And so he was preparing a meal, perhaps chopping wood and fueling an oven. And something happened where he wasn't purifying the materials the kalim that he was working with first. And then when he went to produce the bread was in these kalim that were not purified first. Now, again, what these stories are showing with Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair is that we have to be makpid on all of these issues of separations and taharos, and that is how heaven is going to look at us and judge us, and how we are going to be able to refine ourselves. We refine ourselves through the pursuit of the separation of tithes and through the pursuit of making sure that what we are doing is tahor, and what we are working with is tahor, and that we are acting in a stringent way with this. And then what happens is that we end up becoming more holy, and we end up having a different relationship with Kodesh Baruch Hu. So now we're going to get into these stories about, or these Gemaras about, these lenient other uses. So the Gemara says that wine acquired for mixing into fish sauce, or wine acquired for mixing into aluntis. Aluntis, by the way, is going to be a beverage made out of a balsam oil and water and wine, and it's going to be used as medicine. And the wine for fish sauce was called morias in the Gemara. And what they would do is they would take water and salt, and they would take the fatty parts of fish, particularly the insides, and the oils would come out. And what would happen is you would end up where you would end up with a sauce that had this like deep, fishy, salty note, and it was very commonly used in the cooking, not only in the Roman Empire, but also here in Judea and Samaria. And you can find actual Roman ruins here in Eretz Yisrael, near Caesarea today, where they used to make this fish sauce, where they would take the fish that might have been caught fresh and thrown it into these vats of salt and water, and they had these special tubes that came out where the oil would come out over time. And you can see in Southeast Asian cooking today, like in Thailand or Vietnam, and that cooking there, they're using fish sauce in almost everything. It's quite delicious, and you can find kosher fish sauce with an excellent hechsher. They make it out of tuna. And so really, they're just taking the scraps of tuna and they're mixing it with salt and water, and it breaks down, and you end up with a sauce that is just wonderful, really deep, rich flavors, beautiful food. So the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to say legumes mixed or acquired to be made into a dish of ground legumes. So this is going to be where they're going to grind it and crush it and mix it with seasoning. And we know today, we have falafel and we have hummus. There's a Gemara in the Yerushalmi where they took lentils and they used to grind the lentils and roast it with honey and spices, and they used to make a type of falafel like that back in the day. And so any of these legumes that you're purchasing to grind up are going to be subject to Demai tithes. And it goes without saying that to definite tithes when the produce is definitely tevel. So if you are going to be very careful and, where you're having, definite tevel, your legumes, you have to separate tithes out of your legumes. And if you're buying these ground, legumes that you're going to grind up for your falafel balls, or your wine that you're going to be mixing into your fish sauce, or your wine that you're going to mix into your aluntis medicine, which is used as a salve, well, you have to separate out Demai. And the Gemara is going to address the law of finished mixtures. So what happens if they've already made this? In other words, that you're now buying where, you have the finished fish sauce where they made it with this fish fat and the salt and the water, and they mixed it in with wine, and now you're buying the finished product. Or what about the falafel balls mixed in with these spices and herbs? And the Gemara says, but these mixtures themselves are exempt from Demai tithes. Why is that going to be? And the Rosh Cirilio explains that if someone gets fish sauce, aluntis, or grind legumes from an Amaretz, they are not subject to Demai since they are obtained in an already mixed state. And the Gemara coming up is going to get into this exemption. Why is there an exemption? And so we see that in a finished state, they are going to be exempt from the tithes of Demai. Now, if you just bought wine and then you have fish sauce over here and you just got the wine, well, that's going to be something different. It's not going to be a mixture. You just have wine. And if you get wine, certainly you have to take out tithes, and you also have to worry about tevel. You have to worry about Demai if you get it from an Amaretz. And if you are a haver, which means that you are careful with your tithes, and you have to separate out tithes and make sure you're not having tevel. So even the Amaretz has to separate out the tithes and make sure it's not tevel. So the Gemara assumes that the rationale to exempt these mixtures is going to be that their Demai components are nullified. But that's going to be based on this understanding, but there's a problem with that, right? The idea, you assume, why would this mixture be permitted? What's the reason? Is it because now you have the fish fat, fish sauce inside the wine, and that nullified it? So the Gemara says, which Tana are we dealing with in this Baraisa? And it says, if the Baraisa accords with the view of Rabbi, who holds that wine mixed into fish sauce is not nullified, then even where the wine is Demai, we should be obligated to separate out the tithes. And if the Baraisa accords with the view of Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, who holds that wine mixed into fish sauce is nullified, then even where the wine is definite tevel, it should be exempt from separating out tithes. So there's a dispute between Rabbi and Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon. By the way, there are a lot of disputes between Rabbi and Rabbi Elazar. It happens a lot. And this particular one has to do with mixing truma wine into fish sauce. You can find that in the Yerushalmi and Trumos 1:1. And according to Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, you're not allowed to add, it is prohibited. You're not allowed to add truma wine into fish sauce. And the rationale for that is that the reason to add the wine into the fish sauce is not for the flavor, but to balance out the sauce's bad odor. And this is an irregular use that would waste the truma wine, and that makes it like a destruction of truma. You're not allowed to destroy truma. Rabbi, by the way, in this debate in the Yerushalmi Trumos 11.1. In Trumos 11.1, Rabbi is holding that if your intention by adding the wine is to enhance the flavor of the sauce, then it's normal to use the wine to flavor the mixture, and it's not being regarded as destructive. And because you're not destroying it, it's permitted. So there's a lot of implications about this. So what happens if you're a non-Kohen and you want to consume this mixture? A non-Kohen is not allowed to eat truma. So according to Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, who says that the truma wine in the mixture is deemed to be destroyed and that makes it nullified, then the wine is not regarded as being present in the mixture. It's been destroyed, according to Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon bar Yochai. And so then, a non-Kohen can eat that mixture. But Rebbe is saying that the truma wine is not nullified at all, and it's an essential part of the sauce, and that means that a non-Kohen is not allowed to eat it. So there's a lot of implications about what's going to happen with this fish sauce. And the question is that by subjecting these mixtures to definite tithes, while exempting them from Demai tithes, the Baraisa ends up at odds with both of these Tanayim. So this Baraisa ends up where it doesn't fit with either ruling. And so the Gemara is going to explain the exemption of these mixtures from the Demai obligation, that it is in fact not a matter of nullification. So the Baraisa follows the opinion of Rebbe, who holds that wine is not nullified in fish sauce. And as for the Baraisa's exemption of fish sauce in the law of Demai, we say as follows. The Gemara says this is among the leniencies with which the sages were lenient with Demai. And that's to say that the sages' Demai decree was not stated regarding a mixture, particularly this mixture. So the Gemara is going to explain that, in fact, the wine is not nullified. That's the view of Rabbi, and that makes it subject to definite tithes. But the Mara Fulda is going to explain about this, that the wine is exempt from the Demai obligation, not because it's nullified, but because the Demai decree was never stated regarding mixtures. So if the Amma Aretz is going to produce finished foods, those are not going to be subject to tithing. And Mara Fulda points out about this, that this is one of the leniencies of the Demai decree. And since the majority of the Amaratzim are actually careful to tithe the Truma Gedola in the first place, there is a lot of reason to believe that any batch of produce that's purchased from the Am Haaretz on some level has been tithed. So then in establishing the Demai decree, the rabbis felt there was a room of leniency for these mixed products. And so when you're looking at this debate between Rabbi and Rabbi Elazar ben Shimon, that's going to be where you're talking about definite tevel, or you're talking about definite trumos. But over here, we're talking about a case where the Am Haaretz already probably separated out the Truma Gedola from the product and now mixed it in, and this is going to be regarded as a leniency, and this is going to be a derabanan leniency because, again, it's assumed that the original tithes were taken out. Maybe the rest of the tithes were not taken out, but nonetheless, the Gemara is here to point us out that this is a leniency. We wouldn't have known this without this Gemara in here. We wouldn't have known about this rabbinic leniency with regards to mixtures that you've got from the Am Haaretz. You would assume that it goes back to this debate this maloket tanayim, and you wouldn't be sure about what to do with it. You would end up where, are you going to say that it's been nullified in the case of a mixture, or are you going to say where it's not been nullified, and then you wouldn't know whether you separate out tithes or not. So because the original tithes of the Truma Gedola were probably separated out, and now it's been mixed up, so now in the mixture you end up having a suffix anyway, and anyway it's getting back to this maloket tanayim, and so it's going to end up where they're going to treat this, and the rabbis are going to rule leniency on it. The Brisa is going to talk about the law of a finished mixture. So this is going to be medicinal plaster, and we covered medicinal plasters in Masechet Shvius. One of them is called collyrium. Collyrium is going to be something that they can put on the eye, things like that. So the Gemara is going to put out a distinction. And when we were talking about medical plasters, there was an issue about taking a medical plaster and then taking shvius produce to make a medical plaster. And the worry was that you are wasting it. The shvius produce has some sort of sanctity on it, and now you're destroying it, and there's a problem with that. So the Gemara here in Demai says here regarding the mixture of plaster and collyrium, you say that they are exempt from definite tithes, but here regarding the mixture of fish sauce, luntis, and ground legumes, you say only that they are exempt from Demai tithes, and that's going to imply that they are not exempt from definite tithes. So why is it that one permit is going to be more strict than the other? In other words, that you're saying that here this medicinal plaster is going to be exempt from even tithes with regards to tevel, things like that. And the Gemara is going to explain the difference between something like the fish sauce and something that's going to be like this medical plaster. And the Gemara explains here in the case of fish sauce, luntis, or ground legumes, the wine or the legumes are nullified only upon entering the body where they are consumed. And until that point, they are a distinct component in this mixture and they have to be tithed. But here, in the case of the collyrium and the medical plaster, once he places the wine or the flour into the mixture, it's nullified and it doesn't need to be tithed. So in the first case, the mixture is intended for consumption, and so the wine or the legumes are going to enhance the flavor of that mixture, and the flavor is going to be distinct in the mixture. It's not going to be nullified, and because of that, it has to be tithed, even if, by the way, it's going to be known to be tevel. Now, in the Brice's case over here, where it's a medical plaster, it's going to be put onto the outside of the body. It's not made for consumption, so flavor is not an issue. And over there in Masechet Shvius, we were worried about taking product like flour, and we were worried about taking it and destroying it. It could have the Shvius sanctity and destroying it. You're not allowed to destroy Shvius produce. That's a d'oraita obligation. So over there, you've taken something that was food and you've converted it into something that you've now wasted. Why? Because over there in Masechet Shvius, it has to be available for all people. It's not enough to just say that only some of the people can use it. Who are the some of the people? In the case over there in the Gemara, it was a class of sick people. And it has to be available for use for all people. So you've effectively destroyed it. And over here, the Gemara says, but here in the case of the medical plaster, once he places the wine and the flour into the mixture, it is destroyed. It doesn't need to be tithed. And so Rabbi Kanievsky says about this that once the flour or the wine is placed into the mixture, it's nullified and does not need to be tithed, even if it's known as tevel. Why? Because over there in Shvius, they were worried about it getting destroyed when you turn it into a medical plaster. Same too over here. You've effectively destroyed this wine or this flour. It can't be consumed. It's now a medical plaster. And so even if it was tevel, you don't need to tithe it. So yes, they took a food component, but they destroyed it from being a food component and they turned it into a different use. That, by the way, is going to be a problem that would come up in Trumos. Can you take Shvius produce and destroy it to make it into a medical plaster? No, you can't, because you're not allowed to destroy those products that have sanctity. So the Gemara is going to challenge the suggestion that wine that's put into the collyrium can be nullified. And the Gemara says, but they taught in a brisa collyrium of avodah zarah. So in other words, they're taking collyrium, this plaster that's made from the yain nesach, which is going to be something that the idol worshippers use in their idol worshiping practices. For instance, whatever the Catholics do with their wine, this is a terrible thing. You're not allowed to get benefit of it. And in fact, that's what the Gemara says. It says they taught in Brisa the collyrium of idol worship is prohibited for benefit. In other words, it's going to be the yain nusach that's going to be poured as a libation to an idol, and it is biblically prohibited to get any benefit at all from something that came from avodah zarah. In fact, in Masechet avodah zarah, there's even going to be a question that if you are getting benefit from sitting in the shadow of an Asherah tree, are you allowed to do that? The answer is no, you're not allowed to get benefit from things with avodah zarah. So over here, the collyrium is going to be where it had wine that was used as something for avodah zarah. It's getting put into this plaster, and they're saying that it must be that the wine is not really nullified because you have a medical plaster, and if you were putting in the wine, they're effectively arguing that if you're putting in the wine and it got nullified and it was basically put like betul, like to nothing, then you should be able to use this plaster no problem. Why is it that this is not contradicting the earlier statement about wine being nullified? And the Gemara is going to say that the law of avodah zarah is different. And it is written, says the Gemara, regarding objects from avodah zarah, that it says, and nothing of the banned thing shall cleave to your hand. This, by the way, is Doraita. This is from Devarim 13:8. And the idea here, says the Vilna Goan, is that where it's saying, the verse is saying, and the verse is saying that you're not allowed to have, anything that had idol worshiping objects for benefit. And the mixture is implying that even if there remains only a tiny amount of what was used for the idol, the mixture would be prohibited. So Vilna Goan says, although other prohibited substances would be nullified in these circumstances, items prohibited because of idol worship are not. So the collyrium, where you mix tevel wine, need not be tithed, and that would be that that it's going to be different than where you're mixing in the yain nusach. So the Gemara here is saying that, or the Gemara is implying that the idol worshipping object is prohibited even in a small amount, a minute amount. But then if it's prohibited even in a minute amount, then it must mean that, in the other case, you would have some tevel that might be in this medical plaster. And the Gemara is going to, be implying that, is the wine in this, going to be nullified or not? And the Gemara is going to question this idea that the yain nusach can't be nullified. So the Gemara says, what is the difference between the yain nusach of the collyrium, which is this medical plaster, and the wine sediments of an idol worshiper. And so again, it wants to sort of hone in and get deeper into understanding, is it going to be where you're making this medical plaster, and is it going to be where if you have definite tevel wine in there, is it going to be nullified or not? And what about with the idol worshiping wine, and that you made a medical plaster out of that? Gemara is going to explain this and resolve it. It says, regarding the wine sediments of the idol worshiper, where it says, are they then perhaps not prohibited for benefit? And it says, of course they're prohibited for benefit. Yet the Gemara and the law says that the sediments that become dry are not subject to the prohibition on deriving benefits from idols. And the answer that the Gemara is, the question the Gemara is asking, it says, since any remaining moisture has been nullified, we can see that the yain nusach in a minute amount can be nullified, and the same then should be true of the yain nusach of this plaster, which makes it hard to understand this earlier assertion. So the Mara Fulda says that the Gemara is assuming that the reason that the dried out sediments are permitted, is that the minute amount of nesach wine that remains in existence is nullified ultimately in this medical plaster, and that would contradict this Bryce's ruling that would prohibit collyrium into which one mixed a small amount. And the Gemara doesn't actually end up resolving this. And the Pnei Moshe says about this that the reason the Gemara does not respond is not that it lacks a response, but that the response is so obvious it doesn't need to be said. And contrary to the assumption of the questioner, the reason the dried sediments are permitted is not that the remaining amount of wine is nullified, but that there's no wine that's left out. There's no more wine, it's been dried out. So after the passage of 12 months, the sediments are entirely dried out, and there's not any moisture at all remaining. Therefore, it's permitted. But over here, where some yain nesach remains in this mixture, the entire mixture should be prohibited as per the Bryce's ruling regarding collyrium. Now, I want to look at the Mara Fulda about this because it's interesting. Mara Fulda is explaining that the Gemara's mention of the wine sediments as a challenge to the idea that the yain nesach cannot be nullified. And actually, the Vilna Goan is going to say the opposite. He's going to say that the law of the settlements is intended as proof that nesach wine cannot be nullified. And although there is only a minimal amount of wine in the settlements, they are forbidden for benefit until they dry out completely after 12 months. So, evidently, says the Vilna Goan, even in a minute amount, the yain nesach is not nullified. So, one of the ideas here might be that, again, the Torah says that none of it shall cleave to you. And so that's I think part of the issue that's going on here. In other words, that even if some of this yain nesach exists in a minuscule amount in this medical plaster, the yain nesach is not completely nullified. And so the question then is going to be, well, what actually is going to be the halacha l'maisa regarding the medical plaster? And I believe that it's going to be like in similar to how Masechet Shvius would treat it, where you're not allowed to go and destroy the Shvius product to go and make a plaster out of it, just like you're not allowed to take and nullify the truma wine and put that into a medical plaster. However, over here, where they're talking about a medical plaster, they're saying that once you've taken the wine and put it together with the flour to make this mixture, it does get nullified. And so I think, we look at Rabbi Kanievsky on this, and he's saying, that, once the wine or the flour is placed into the, this mixture, it is nullified and does not need to be tithed, even if it's known to be tevel. And, part of that is going to be that, the mixture is not intended for consumption. So therefore, flavor is not a factor at all. And what's a little bit different about the Yain Nusach, it says that, you're not allowed to have any benefit. None of it shall cleave to you at all. So, if some of it does exist in a small amount, and you're using it as a medical plaster, you are getting a benefit from something that came from idol worship. Over here, when you're making the medical plaster, you've made it where the wine or the flour is not intended for consumption anymore, and therefore flavor doesn't matter, and that's why it gets nullified. I think that's the difference. So it's going to be where it gets put into this status where it's not intended for consumption. Now, where we're talking about the mixtures where it is intended for consumption, and the wine and the beans and the legumes are going to end up enhancing the mixture, since the flavor is going to be distinct in the mixture, it doesn't get nullified, and therefore if you know it's tevel, you have to separate out tithes, and I think that's going to put it together. So tomorrow we're going to get into the next part of what the Mishnah is going to talk about with boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, and that is going to be very similar to what we covered in Masechet Shvius. Have a great day.